Judicial independence under threat. First, the government unleashed a series of reforms aimed at exerting more control over judges, and now it's passed legislation making it a punishable offence for judges to complain about it. And Imran Gafta in today's Newsmaker is what critics are calling Poland's muzzle law. For the past 5 years, Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party has enacted a series of measures that are seemingly at odds with its name. Human Rights Watch has described reforms to the judiciary as draconian restrictions to judicial independence. Judges have been subjected to disciplinary action, censure, and even death threats. Critics say it's stifling opposition voices from the bench and at the same time eliminating any checks on President Andrzej Duda's power. The European Union says it violates the commitment Poland made to following the rule of law under the bloc's founding treaty. But Poland's leaders see it differently. They say it's a way to weed out corruption and purge the bench of lingering communist influences. We'll look at both sides of the debate later in the show. But first, Haider Abbasi has more on why people are venting their anger.
Tens of thousands of people are rallying on the streets of Warsaw, led by judges who say Poland's judicial independence is being violated.
This is the most shameful bill that our parliament has put forward in the last few years. This act is, of course, going against the Constitution and European Union law. It is an act that eliminates the independence of the courts, the independence of judges, the self-governance of courts, and it is an act which implements a repressive disciplinary system against judges.
And they're not alone. The bill, which was signed into law on Tuesday, has been opposed by the United Nations, the European Union, and Poland's opposition. Judges from other EU nations have joined the protests in Poland. Under the law, judges can be fined or dismissed for questioning judicial appointments made by politicians. Since coming to power in 2015, the Law and Justice Party has been making reforms to the judiciary. One of the changes allows MPs, rather than judges, to nominate candidates to the bench. Poland's Supreme Court has ruled this is neither independent nor impartial. But Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki says the changes are necessary to make the judicial system more efficient and to remove judges who may have had links to Poland's former communist government.
Unfortunately, we can find ourselves built into a situation of legal chaos, legal disorder, a situation which is very dangerous for the Polish system and the legal order. As a Prime Minister, I cannot let that happen.
Some legal analysts have warned that Poland's reforms threaten its membership of the European Union. But the government says Polish law is sovereign and that the EU can't interfere in its domestic affairs. So are these reforms making Poland more authoritarian? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now to discuss this, we have Renata Mienkowska-Norkiene. She joins us from Luxembourg. She's a political scientist at the University of Warsaw, as well as a sociologist. And joining us from Krakow is Marcin Makowski, a commentator who specializes in Polish politics. Good to have you both on the program. Renata, do you see this clearly as a muzzle law?
Absolutely. And there is no doubt about that, first of all, because it's highly politically grounded, which means that the government of Law and Justice doesn't definitely want to have judges claiming that Law and Justice is acting against the Constitution and also fixing the law by judgments. Secondly, the Law and Justice's, let's say, steps now, they are quite drastic. They are there simply to finish the reform, and the reform goes against the Constitution it also actually is not well grounded, because you properly mentioned that the society wasn't fully satisfied with the judiciary, but it has never actually been against, let's say, anything but separate incidental, let's say, situations, or general impression that, well, there is a kind of dissatisfaction with efficiency. But during the Law and Justice term, nothing has changed for better, despite the fact that the reform is extremely deep. Actually, the opposite. The lawsuits are longer, the tribunals deal with less cases actually than before, those taken by the Law and Justice influence, which means, and taken by actually the Law and Justice, which basically means that it's absolutely only politically grounded.
I see.
And it goes against the Constitution.
Okay, so Marcin, Renata really set out her stall there. She put all her arguments on the table there. She's clearly against this and sees this as the government trying to remove the judicial checks and balances on their society. Do you see it as clearly as that, Marcin?
I'm not aside of this argument, because I'm not a politician either. I am a judiciary expert, but I can see that and judge from the political perspective, from the outcome that it has to the Polish society. Of course, we are in the middle of the huge constitutional struggle in Poland. Of course, there is a very good argument that this government is probably taking this 1 or 2 steps too far in a matter of Polish constitution. But from the other hand, there is also stubbornness from the perspective of the judiciary itself, that has 30 years to reform itself, to be a better, more sufficient way of doing their job, but they fail to make that promise into the reality. So probably we are in the beginning, or maybe in the middle of the war or conflict that is not solvable by the current situation, the current struggle between government and judiciary, because also our society is split almost half by half. If in a matter of saying, is it good or is it bad into the Polish political system and judiciary reform. I would rather prefer to see both sides have any way of compromise to make judiciary in Poland work to the benefit of the common people on the ground, not to the benefit of the politicians or benefit to the judiciary as a whole.
Okay. So hold on for a second.
Speaking about that, right, without seeing that it's supposed to work for the citizen.
Okay, I want to bring in Spasimir Domaradzki in Warsaw, a third contributor to the panel. He's an assistant professor of political science at Lazarski University. Spasimir, I'm sure you heard what Renata had to say and what Marcin had to say. Marcin's more in the middle, as he claims. Renata sees this as clearly an attack on the judiciary, whereas Marcin's saying, well, there needs to be judicial reform. Maybe they're not doing it perfectly. Where do you stand on this, Spasimir?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for bringing me to this panel. And secondly, unfortunately, I couldn't hear exactly what Renata was saying due to some technical issues. But I'm very happy to be with you. And thank you also for this brief summary, because I was also not able to hear everything that was being said in the debate. Well, here is my point. I mean, I'm very happy that I hear from Mr. Makowski the argument that, well, on one hand, there is a need for reform, but most probably it is not being done in the proper way. I think that we would probably all agree that there is a need for reform. There is a need for reform for a very long period of time, but I think that we should touch upon the essence of the problem, which is actually the political environment in which this reform is being made and the ways it is being made, because these are the two aspects that in practical terms lead to this enormous confrontation. And I have to admit that if I even agree that the Polish society is split into two groups, this reform simply deepens this enormous enormous gap within the Polish society.
Right.
And I think it's an extremely harmful process
Right.
for the Polish nation as a whole. And in that respect, I think that the way the reform is being done, well, we have seen what has happened over the last 24 hours. We had President Macron visiting Poland, sending signals what is the general expectation about the muzzle law, and then we see what happens right after he leaves. I mean, there is an apparent scenario that this law should be introduced, not simply because of itself, but because it is a small step of a wider strategy that aims,
right.
first of all, to take as much ground as it is possible. And once you take it, of course, the Polish government will have to withdraw from some of these reforms, but it will still have gained much more than it is simply this particular law.
Right. Renata, I want to ask you about the judge, Paweł Juszczyszyn, who,
Yes.
I mean, this is fascinating because the judge acted on a decision by the European Court of Justice and was punished for that, right? So,
And
if
the
we
resolution of
Right.
the Supreme, that's
right,
also important.
right.
which
So they
actually
stripped him of his
ended up
earnings. Right. So 40% of his earnings stripped and suspended. So is that the clearest indication yet that Polish judges need to act in the interests of what Law and Justice think is Poland's interest rather than the Europeans? That the two are extremely different.
But look, Polish judges, they aren't politically involved. They shouldn't be politically involved, and they know it perfectly. The problem now is not political involvement. It's just staying in line with the law. And so the judge, Paweł Juszczyszyn, he just fulfilled what the Court of Justice of the European Union decided in its ruling, and then what the Polish Supreme Court in its resolution confirmed. And now the problem with this, let's say, muzzle law, the biggest problem is that it creates enormous chaos instead of curing anything. Look, now we have judges that shouldn't actually make any decisions according to the EU law, so to the ruling of the Court of Justice and to the resolution of the Supreme Court, while they are now actually making these decisions. So now imagine a person who gets divorced. They don't know if they are divorced legally, if the judge deciding is a person appointed by the Judicial Council, which shouldn't have appointed this person, let's say, now.
Right.
And the problem is the chaos. This is exactly what this government wants to achieve. It uses the fact that the Polish are divided, but let's be honest, if you go to the court and if there is a regular contradictory lawsuit, there is always someone who loses and who wins. It's not about, let's say, the sympathy or, let's say, support of the society. It's about staying in line with the Constitution, with the EU law, which we all obliged ourselves to fulfill. And this is not just someone's, like one or other judge's idea. No, it's the law which is legally binding. And let's say the society can change the constitution, it can influence the political situation, but it cannot influence the lawsuits
Renata,
and the ruling.
Okay, so let me ask Marcin about this, right? Because what's interesting about this is that you have, at every level of analysis, seemingly Polish society is being affected. So on the one hand, its relationship with the European Court of Justice, with the European Union, its role within this collection of nations bound by common ideals and so on. So European Court of Justice says, do this thing, but if you're a judge and you push for that, you might be punished by your own government. And on the other hand, as Renata is saying, it creates a sense of confusion because even when you're getting divorced, there's no clarity about the legal process. So it affects the ordinary citizens as well. So are we going to see, contrary to what the government's saying, more chaos in a legal sense? Is Renata right, Marcin?
Of course, there is a chaos, but there is also, like I said before, a little bit of stubbornness from the judiciary reform as well, because we don't see any kind of common ground. Perhaps there is none. Perhaps there is one side who's right here, and it's not for me to judge because you have to be a constitutional expert because this is so in-depth in a matter of law us in a matter of who's thinking what if they're not an expert. But I would like to stress one thing that is always good to clear the situation, that is to show a little bit context surrounding this process, that chaos, that struggle that we are having in the judiciary reform right now in Poland. We are speaking about an argument between government and the judiciary system in Poland about judges that are being prosecuted, but we are speaking about a couple of people and about struggle that is still inside the democratic debate in Poland, even if this is in the boundary of democratic debate. But I find this a little bit ironic that we are speaking that in the television of the country that prosecuted almost 3,000 judges,
but you know,
jailed them
Marcin,
as well.
Marcin, you know what? We have. But Marcin, are you an expert on the Turkish judicial system? This is the thing, because I figured you're going to pull this out. We on this show, listen, Marcin. But we've had Turkish guests talk about the Turkish judicial system on this very show. So are you offering yourself up as an expert when we do that show? Because we can book you as well. So do some reading and then you can join. Because here you're throwing a dig because you don't have an argument here. So is no country allowed to talk about any other country? How about we talk about the Turkish judicial system during our shows about the Turkish judicial system when we get the experts about the Turkish judicial system? Is that cool?
I am saying just if you want to judge Polish judiciary reform,
are we judging it? So we can't talk about it. Nobody can talk about it. You sound very defensive here. It sounds as if you've got something to hide.
I'm here to talk about this, but I'm seeing a little bit irony that we are speaking to the television in the country that imprisoned almost 3,000
But it's interesting because we
didn't imprison.
There hasn't been a semblance of bias here. Okay, but Marcin, there hasn't been a semblance of bias here. We ask basic questions, and your first answer is, oh, it's ironic because your country has problems. It sounds awfully defensive and sounds as if you're someone who doesn't want to answer the question. So let me, rather than go to Spasimir, who seems to be more legitimately interested in this.
I can answer whatever.
No, it's okay. You want to talk about the Turkish judiciary. Spasimir Domaradzki, I want to ask you about the communist element here, because, and I've got a clip lined up from Dominik Tarczynski, because in 2018, when the wheels were sort of set in motion for this policy, I interviewed the Polish MP Dominik Tarczynski, and I asked him about this situation and this battle between the government and the judges. Have a little listen to what his response was to me, Spasimir. Have a listen.
You have to understand the history of Poland. We keep repeating, some of these judges are the judges coming from the communist times, the ones who were judging during the martial law. These people shouldn't be the judges. That's number one. This is what are the expectations from the Polish society. This is what we promised during the campaign. So I think this is fair, to have a major democracy, not the communist judges.
Spasimir, these Polish judges are communists left over from the bad old days, and we need to weed them out. That was part of the argument that Dominik made to me. Does it have any legitimacy?
Well, let me put it that way. Most recently, there was a list of the judges that are still active, and it turns out that from approximately 8,000 judges, something like 740 something judges were nominated during communist times, but paradoxically the head of the Constitutional Tribunal, which is now a strong supporter of law and justice, and is strongly supported by Law and Justice, was not on this list, although she was also nominated. And then the answer was that since she is now the head of the Constitutional Tribunal, she is no longer an active judge. But let me go back to the essence of your question. And the essence of your question is to what extent the communist legacy is still haunting us. And I have to admit that, well, what actually Marcin started saying, Makowski, before you cut him off, was that, this communist narrative is actually the strongest element explaining what is happening today, produced by the Polish authorities to the Polish people. In other words, we do something that was not being done for the last 30 years. Now, if I have to be frank, this is a very serious issue, but with the time it is becoming less and less important. And I think that in a nutshell, this argument is with every single year becoming less and less valuable, and its value would have really been significant in the early 90s, not in the end of the second decade of the 21st century. And the second very important point is that we should have in mind that if we were acknowledging the importance of this reform, it should not have been done in terms of confrontation, but in terms of consensus all across the society. In other words, what you see is overnight signing of legislation, mockery of public debate, pressure and accusation, and extreme, let's say, speed with which the reform needs to be introduced, because the aim, in a nutshell, is not so much to create a genuinely new judicial system that functions on a clear basis, but the aim is simply to capture the judiciary, which seems to be the only still resisting body to the absolute dominance of one political party over the whole society.
So let me ask, so Marcin, is that fair that the state or the government and this ruling party wants to capture the judiciary, which is holding out stubbornly because it's captured everything else so far? Marcin?
I'm sorry, was it a question for me? Because
yes,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning of the question. I'm just trying to infer that I'm agreeing almost completely with the professor that was speaking before me, that the idea of reforming the judiciary should not be personal, but more systematical to the approach of the changing the speed of the how court is working, changing the flow of the cases. That should be the aim of every government. That is not even up to debate. How it went, it's what we are discussing right now, and unfortunately not a greatest outcome that society should expect and could expect. But it's still everything in the hands of the one party. We still have democratic elections. We are having one presidential election in mind. It was just announced today.
Listen, Marcin, we've lost you for
right. We're still having a more or less functional.
Marcin, your Skype is a bit choppy, so we lost you for a little bit here. I can still see you, but your audio is going up and down. So apologies to the viewers for that as well. But we got the gist of what you were saying. Renata, is there, for you at least, and for the protesters on the streets, I don't ask you to speak on behalf of the protesters, but you share a similar view. Have you reached a point of no return because of the atmosphere of all of this? The fact that it has been so personal, the fact that the government has wielded a lot of power to, in many ways, smear the judges. Is there nothing that the government can do now to convince you otherwise? Do you distrust their intentions?
Well, the government should then simply make all the steps back and then start a real reform. You mentioned the communist, let's say, judges. I just wanted to add one thing. The most important person regarding judiciary in the Polish parliament was Ryszard Piotrowicz, who was a former prosecutor in the communist time, having really prosecuted opposition activists. So if Law and Justice really could legitimately use this argument, they should have done something with this particular person, and they nominated Ryszard Piotrowicz for a judge of the Constitutional Tribunal. So, it's not about a reform. It's only about having influence and actual power over the judiciary. So if I really wanted to trust them, first they would have to step back in everything and then begin this reform, which I fully agree is necessary, but it's about systemic changes like ICT programs which would speed up, let's say, the cases, some systemic solutions of, let's say, attributing cases to the judges. It's about trainings for the judges. It's about division of some competences. This is what the reform should be about. I don't trust this power not as a person, as a citizen, but as a political scientist, because I never trust any power who at least claims to be democratic, while they are fully destroying the tripartite division of powers to execution, of course, legislation, and then judiciary. This is what they are actually doing. They have it all in their hands.
Okay, we're out of time, and one of the broader issues that I'd love to discuss later on is, you know, the drift away from the European Union, and whether, if the European Union holds back grants, if that will actually hurt Poland and make them reverse course or make them double down. I mean, these are interesting questions. Renata, Marcin, and Spasimir, it's been a pleasure having you all and having your different perspectives on the program. I've got to wrap, unfortunately. Thanks for joining us here on The Newsmakers. And thank you so much for watching. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.